Good afternoon. My name is Suzanne Nossel, and I'm the CEO of PEN America, the literary and free expression organization. On behalf of PEN America and our co-hosts at the Brennan Center for Justice and NYU Law, I'm delighted to welcome you to our panel discussion, Disinformation versus Democracy, Soros and the Fight for Open Societies. In recent years, we've witnessed a drastic weakening of democratic institutions in the US and around the world. According to Freedom House, 3/4 of the people on earth now live in countries where democracy is in retreat. Mass refugee flows, widening wealth disparities, economic dislocations, entrenched racism, and new technologies that weaponize disinformation are sowing divisions and challenging public faith in democratic institutions. As a Jewish child in Hungary during the Holocaust, George Soros witnessed firsthand where authoritarianism, misplaced faith in charismatic leaders, and mass scapegoating can lead. He's dedicated his life and a tremendous portion of his personal wealth to fight for open societies. In return, he's been demonized and smeared with anti-Semitic slurs and conspiracy theories. Jesse Dillon premiered his documentary Soros last November during one of the most fraught moments in US political history. The film asks vital questions about the future of open societies, especially as democracies face unprecedented assaults on free expression, voting rights, and election integrity. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I'd like to show a short clip from the documentary Soros. Please take a look.
Who's funding Black Lives Matter? One of the big donors seems to be George Soros, our old pal.
This is a George Soros-funded anarchist effort.
Those who are stirring it up, many of them work for George Soros' front organizations.
That wasn't a spontaneous event. It was organized by far-left groups, which received millions of dollars from the liberal activist George Soros.
Do you believe George Soros is behind all of this?
I tend to believe it. I believe it fits in his attack mode that he has and how he uses his...
The world makes more sense if you simply have a single 85-year-old mastermind pulling all the world's strings and doing the things that you fear and dislike.
This guy is a guy who knowingly assisted in the execution of Jews.
There's a whole history of Jews being portrayed as controlling money, controlling the banking systems. At the same time, Soros was becoming more and more political, a larger donor in the Democratic Party in the United States.
Some people hate him because he's Jewish, and some people hate him because of his politics. And often those two come together.
Thank you. I now want to introduce our panel. We have, and these are just brief identifiers. You can find their full bios online. We have with us Mark Malloch-Brown, president of the Open Society Foundations, Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law and author of The Fight to Vote, Andre Banks, founder and CEO of AB Partners and Win Black, Arisha Hatch, vice president and chief of campaigns at Color of Change, and Jesse Dillon, the director of Soros. Welcome all. I want to start with you, Jesse, if I can, and just ask about when you first conceived the film. And at the time, was the narrative arc already apparent with its strong emphasis on the campaign to undermine George Soros and this pattern of democratic backsliding around the world? Or did the story change as you were making the film?
Well, I've worked for Open Society Foundations for a long time, for Mark, who's on this panel, and gradually over the time I worked for the Open Society Foundations, I just got to a deeper and deeper understanding of the work that it was doing, and as I did that, I sort of started to think about why so many people had this other view of George Soros, because the view that I had from sort of going around the world with him was very, very different. And so, we decided to make the movie. I decided to make the movie, a long time into that process because I just saw that conflict, and then it took a very long time for George to give me permission to make the movie, and then just gradually the story changes as it keeps on changing. Even now today, it's different than it was. So yeah, that's sort of how it happened.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I want to turn to you. George Soros says at one point in the film that societies are like financial markets and that they never go back, they always move forward. But it's not clear whether he means forward towards something new or forward in the sense of making affirmative progress, in this case, toward more open societies. And thinking about this climate of a reversal of democracies underway in Eastern Europe, paring back in India, the coup in Myanmar and elsewhere, curious if you can help us sort of situate this moment in the long arc. Is it kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back? Is this a sort of temporary reversal of fortunes that you think we will overcome? Or is there maybe no discernible pattern to count on at all?
Well, thanks. And Jesse, a great movie, by the way. So thanks from all of us, your fans. Look, George loves to joke that he only sort of thinks about the future and forgets the past. And, he is in that sense, despite now being 90 years old, a very sort of an individual still thinking about what's around the corner, which was the genius he brought to financial markets. But I think the quote he makes is really about the fact that, he thrived on uncertainty in those financial markets and lived uncertainty in his life, as you put it, this, child who grew up in Holocaust Hungary, then communist Hungary, fled to the West. His life has been imbued with uncertainty and change, and has led him to sort of hold fast to the values of open society as the only way human beings can live in peace with each other, if you like, in a creative peace where everybody's voice is heard and everybody is respected. But I don't think by the reference to markets, he thinks it's a one-way journey, as your question implies. Quite the contrary. When he started Open Society in the mid-80s, freedom for Eastern Europe and South Africa, the 2 places he started, seemed a long way away. Then came the fall of the Berlin Wall and a kind of 20-year sweep of history which seemed to sweep, barriers to democracy and human rights and the rule of law away. And then from pick your moment, 9/11 or the financial crash of 2008-9, we've moved to a very different world where again open society is under attack, where we're in a period, if you like, of market recession, not market growth and boom. And George is very conscious of that because that's his biography. That there are breaks for open society, but then there are setbacks, and you have to fight continuously to promote and push ahead the values you care about.
Helpful. I want to turn to you, Arisha, and ask about sort of the evolution of this fight. And I'm wondering whether you or how you think about sort of a possible tension between rights-based, race-neutral discourse, ideas like equal opportunity and non-discrimination, and the set of legal constructs around them that underpin so much of our conception of what it means to guarantee an open society, particularly in this country, but also in international law and around the world, versus more explicitly race-based policies and approaches that may be necessary to eradicate racism and effectuate a society truly open to all. Do you see that as a tension, and your thoughts about how to reconcile it, if so?
No, absolutely. It feels like a tension. I remember being a law student and learning about different levels of scrutiny, depending on the situation that you were in. believe that there needs to be an investment in affirmative race-based policies that are sort of like agreed upon by folks that are directly impacted in order to get to a space, in order to get to that future where we can actually move to this race-neutral, colorblind sort of world and thinking in space. But race is being used as a reason to disenfranchise so many people, and we have to, I think, specifically address that through policies and different approaches in order to actually move forward.
I mean, do you see it as sort of perhaps a mistaken strategy, or an impediment in how we've sort of gone about this quest for an open society, that perhaps the race neutral, equality based ideas came first, and we're now sort of trying to work in a more explicitly race oriented agenda, that it comes in tension with so many of these precedents. So how do you think about that? I mean, do we have to pare it back and then come back to it later? Or how do you look at the sequencing?
Yeah, I mean, what I see is when I talk to like normal people about race, and when I talk to white people about race, and I'm thinking through an American context, not through like a global context. But what I hear is a lot of people saying that they're colorblind, that they were raised not to see race, they were raised not to see gender. And really, the reality is they were raised to like lie and say that they don't see race and gender. And I think that this sort of like race neutral approach that we're seeing through legal systems like feeds in and is very much connected to that narrative. And the work that we have to do is actually going back and saying to people like, no, you see all these things. We can prove to you that you see all these things. It affects your world. It affects the way that you walk through the world. It affects the decisions that you make. And what we see at Color of Change as an organization that is doing work to improve the lives of Black people in the United States is that racial justice is becoming a majoritarian issue. It is the thing in the middle of the pandemic that gets people to come out and sort of protest. And so playing into sort of this narrative that race doesn't matter, that we're already in this sort of colorblind future, I think is certainly premature.
And Michael, I want to come to you on this and just get your perspective running an organization that you guys work to defend so many of these neutral standards that we kind of think of as the underpinning of our democracy. And curious whether your thinking on these questions has evolved and how you might suggest that we sort of fit these sometimes competing ideas together.
Well, I do think that there's an intrinsic tension, but I think it's overblown and something of a false choice, at least right now at this moment. In a way, what movements for social change in the United States, again, I'm talking in the context of the US, have always done is to take those founding ideals of equality and liberty and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the language that government is legitimate only when it rests on the consent of the governed. And we know, of course, that these were not describing the conditions or even the mindset of the white men who owned property, who wrote those or who had power at that point. But we've used those ideals as a goad, in a sense, an ideal toward which we would drive. And so if you look at the period from 1965 forward, where Black Americans in particular fought for the Voting Rights Act and to create that formally equal society, but they really won those rights for everybody. And this notion of race neutral, egalitarian rights, which we now see as the kind of the atmosphere we're all in, was the product of some very specific communities fighting for their own rights. The challenge is that right now, it's the attack on those rights that is quite race specific, even if not always articulated. As you know, we're working with so many others on this panel and others fighting to protect the right to vote in the United States from the most sustained attack on the right to vote since the Jim Crow era. And, and the response to an election that was something of a civic miracle is Trump's big lie, the insurrection, but now this wave of voter suppression in the states. And these are laws that on their face are neutral, but are in fact targeted very precisely to cut out voters of color and young voters and poor voters. Stacey Abrams very eloquently calls it, or aptly calls it, Jim Crow in a suit and tie. So while I do think that this is a challenge, and I do think there's a great value in rather militantly standing up for these universal values articulated as open society, articulated as the civic religion that we all want to aspire to in the United States. I think, in fact, right now, the attack on that is coming in race-specific ways from those who oppose those values.
Andre, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on that if you would like, but also to bring up sort of a different theme that emerges in the film and that I know relates to your work on disinformation, which is where we crossed paths most recently. So there's a lot of talk in the film about open societies and freedom of speech, particularly as a catalyst for truth and progress. It's something we have a lot of faith in, at Penn. It's one of the principal rationales of why we are dedicated to the protection of free speech, the notion that doubt and deliberation and discourse are preferable to trying to ram an ideology down the throats of a public or an audience, and that they can enable a self-correcting society that sees where it goes wrong. And I'm curious, to what extent do you think that social media and disinformation have impaired this mechanism whereby openness is a pathway toward truth, by flooding our discourse with distractions and sowing doubt about how to distinguish fact from falsehood?
Yeah, it's hard to look at the world around us, to scroll through a feed and not feel like that's true. It's hard to go through a week or a month living your life online and feel like you're actually more sensibly informed about how to participate as a citizen or sort of show up even in basic everyday life. It just feels like there's so much out there that just seems like it's almost conspiring to distract us or to push us away from a more reasonable discourse and dialogue. But this isn't an accident. I think one thing I always come back to is the easy answer to the question is yes, these platforms and the misinformation that's on these platforms is making it harder for us to participate together in a democracy, but in particular to participate together in a multiracial democracy in which people of all races have to come as equal members of civil society to make decisions, to build compromises. And what we see in these platforms over and over is not that it's an accident, but they are actually engineered to promote the kind of extremism we see, whether it's the anti-Semitism that's featured in the film, whether it's the connection between that anti-Semitism and then being able to say George Soros is the person who is controlling all of these Black-led groups, completely erasing Black leadership from a picture of in that story whatsoever. These are things that are not an accident. These are a set of choices that are made and how these platforms work. They help drive engagement with the platforms, but they don't help drive civil discourse, and they certainly don't help to drive a sort of healthy democracy.
And do you have thoughts? It's a big tension for a lot of us who are involved in free expression or civil liberties organizations, that wanting to come to grips with those harms and realizing that they are thwarting some of the underlying rationale for free speech and openness, and yet running right up against all the reasons why we hesitate to empower those in positions of authority, whether it's government or these incredibly dominant platforms, to police speech, at will. So how do you in your head sort of reconcile that tension?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is that because of the way these companies have evolved and some of these platforms have evolved, we sort of have things mixed up in the wrong categories. We want to treat an engineer writing an algorithm at Facebook like the opinion editor at the New York Times. These two people are not the same. They don't play the same role in our society. They don't have the same kind of accountability. These are two very different folks driven by two very different businesses. And so I think one thing that we have to do is just figure out, what are we regulating as media? What's the media that we want to have open to keep conversations, diverse conversations open? And then what are the kinds of platforms that are like utilities where people are telling stories that should be regulated the way that other utilities are regulated? And so I think a big piece of this is, knowing who we're actually dealing with and making sure we're holding them to the right standard.
All right, Jesse, I want to turn back to you on this question of disinformation. One thing we've confronted a lot in our work at PEN America is the dilemma that journalists have faced in how to cover disinformation and conspiracy theories and hoaxes without amplifying or propelling them. We've learned that the purveyors of disinformation look at the mainstream media as a primary tool. That is their most potent mechanism for getting their ideas into the mainstream. And yet journalists have an obligation to talk about these things, and we as citizens need to be made aware of them. And I'm wondering how you thought about that in the context of making this film, where you do deal in depth with all of the nefarious and baseless charges against George Soros. Did you worry that you were kind of aerating those and that some people might sort of pass by and come away with the wrong idea? And how do you think, even beyond your own work, we should consider that dilemma?
Well, for me, I think the thing is that, and George, I'm sure would agree with this, is critical thinking. You have to have a informed electorate in some sort of way where people are able to make decisions critically. And then one of the things that we've sort of lost over the last few years is trusted source of information. So all of the places where we get our information are sort of biased, and that makes it so that a person doesn't know where to stand. They don't know which way the wind is blowing on these things. And so that's the way misinformation can sneak in there, because we don't have a trusted source. We don't have Walter Cronkite to tell us, this is what it is. And so, there can be a million new Walter Cronkites, but we have to go back to some place where we trust the source of the information that we're getting. And and I think that'll happen. I'm not sure that you can regulate Facebook in the way that we would like to. Banning Trump, for instance, I'm not sure that that's really the right answer. I think that he was horrible, but banning him does not necessarily get us where we want to go. Snuffing out a voice doesn't help create an open society, even though I disagree with everything he has to say.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, wondering if you want to comment on how you think about, or the foundation thinks about, this question of the role of disinformation and these incredibly powerful social media platforms as, perhaps both a catalyst and an impediment to the thriving of open societies. How do you weigh that up, and what do you think is the role of an open society defender, a bulwark like the foundation, in navigating the impact of these non-state actors on, the discourse we inhabit?
Well, I think it's huge. If we go back in a sense to, where we began the discussion, George Soros is hit because, of his past, his history, his Jewishness. But actually, there are other people who don't share those traits who are also hit in the social media, because, in some ways, there's almost as much now done against Bill Gates in the social media as there is against George Soros. And in Gates's case, conspiracies around why is he promoting, a COVAX vaccine distribution. And so, big foundations having their philanthropy thrown back in their face is not peculiar anymore just to open society. This is happening, across space. And one of the reasons is the sort of disinformation world of the social media. It has encouraged this environment of conspiracy theories, unchecked news, and when you combine it with a broken media economy, that the traditional media on which we relied, the Walter Cronkites, not just nationally, but the local newspaper in one's town or the radio station, when all of that is being undermined by business models that no longer make these news outlets viable and are being replaced by, a highly partisan, screamy kind of social media or cable television model of news distribution, there are a lot of victims. And so for us, not because we come under attack from it, but because the very values of truth and freedom and decent discussion and respect between people is so put in jeopardy by what's happened to the whole sort of information society in which we operate, it has become a growing area of importance for us to both press for proper regulation of the social media, but also to work through our grant making and investment in how we can sort of build up new media models which are attractive to the readers and consumers of them, but which offer decent, fact-checked truth.
Another question, related, I think, but distinct, which is this trend toward a kind of revanchist nostalgia. And I'm curious, I don't know if it was something that George Soros and others ever imagined arising in the days of the precipitous demise of the Soviet Union, that there would come a time where Russians were encouraged to look back with rose-colored enthusiasm for even some of the harshest moments of the communist era. And we see it in the film in relation to Hungary, this kind of drive to resurrect a glorious moment. And I'm curious sort of how you think the quest for an open society ought to grapple with that and what the implications are. I'm thinking particularly about the present moment here in this country, having just gotten through the Trump years, where I think it's a very realistic possibility. And there's a group of Americans that are deeply invested in a narrative where hundreds of thousands of deaths during a pandemic was somehow a heyday. And so I'm curious sort of how you think about that and what you think we ought to do to tamp down on that propensity.
Well, I mean, I think George has imbued Open Society Foundations with a deep sense of the importance of history and of the demons and ghosts which don't go away. And that is a very Central European historical experience which they have lived through in cycles for centuries. And so I suspect George is in many ways less surprised by this dangerous sentimentalism than many of us might be. But even those of us who've grown up in easier, more open places know that the way that the sort of swings and roundabouts of history and sentiment, and that the leader who left office in disgrace quickly becomes sentimentally rebadged a hero a few years down the road. And the danger is that when you think you've driven a stake through the heart of something like Trump, and that this extraordinary aberration and criminal sort of derelict who ran America for 4 years, that surely you'll never see his like again. And I think we all know it ain't like that, and that many are holding on to the legend, and that Biden is going to have difficulty sustaining through a second term the kind of centrist democratic politics that he's driving. And so I think George's lesson, and he's shared it with the foundation, is we've always got to be on our watch. we're never better than the battles we've won today, because there are going to be more that we have to win tomorrow. And every time we lose, you can get major setbacks. So I don't think there's a theory of history, but there is a theory of sort of energetic engagement, that this is a long war and you're never better than your last fight.
Okay, Arisha, I want to come back to you and ask about the question of leadership, which is a very powerful theme in the film. We see these iconic figures, Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel, the now disgraced Aung San Suu Kyi. We think here about the movement leaders of the 1960s who are household names to this day. Martin Luther King and John Lewis, Julian Bond, Rosa Parks, feels like they're on the tips of our tongues. And I'm curious, do you think we have both within movements and in our politics sort of that level of leadership? Has something changed? Is it more diffuse now? And what does that mean for the progression of these battles?
I mean, I think one of the clear things that has changed is that who's allowed to be a leader, who's allowed to be a visible leader within movements has shifted, at least in the US context. Like, we see more women leadership, we see more openly gay leadership, we see, you don't have to necessarily be a reverend, all those sorts of things, I think are beginning to shift. We also are in a social media ecosystem where many people have more access to be thought leaders, public thought leaders for others. And so, I think those are the ways in which the paradigm has shifted. I think that there have always been lots of people doing the hard work of winning change. I think we're a little bit more open about who we're willing to recognize.
Okay, I want to take a question from the audience, from the chat. Senator Sherrod Brown held a hearing on dark money in elections, seeking to get Congresspeople on record as to their support of weakening dark money. And the question is, what position does George Soros take on dark money contributions? But I'm curious, with this panel, and maybe we can start with you, Michael, sort of how you look at this issue, because there are arguments for some protections of anonymity. And so what is your analysis?
Well, there is some argument, and there's, the nonprofit laws governing all different groups allow for anonymous gifts. The Brennan Center receives some, and others do as well, although the vast number of our gifts are disclosed. But I do think that there's something particular about the political system, political money, which is regulated, because voters have a right to know who is spending money on ads to influence their vote, who is spending money on ads to back politicians. And one of the consequences of Citizens United and other misguided Supreme Court decisions that we have is, in a sense, an effectively deregulated campaign finance system in the United States, which has ushered in not just dark money, but the dominance of political fundraising by big donors of a kind we have not seen since the Gilded Age. I think in that context, it's all part of one significant problem.
If anyone else wants to come in on any of these audience questions, you can let me know in the chat or just gesture. There's sort of two questions we've gotten that I'll try to link together, which are really about sort of the people who seem to be beyond the reach of reason. One question is there a model for deprogramming those who've been radicalized as nationalists, xenophobes at scale? Do we even engage with them, or do we focus on giving power and platform to those who espouse an open society? And the other question is about those who may perceive themselves as powerless, gaining power from embracing the most outlandish conspiracy theories and a kind of dangerously perverse anti-intellectualism, how to reach people who are also anti-education, anti-critical thinking, and siloed by social platforms. I don't know, Andre, if you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I will comment on that. I think one of the things that for me really stands out as being so sort of terrifying about the moment that we're in is this idea that, we actually have created a set of tools that make it possible for fringe elements who for the last 70 years, like one of the great, I think, successes of coming out of the Second World War and the fight and investment in open societies was actually pushing some of these fringe elements into the sidelines, into the shadows. And when they came out, to make it almost impossible for them to come into the light without receiving the kind of attention, the kind of critique, sustained critique that you would want to see that actually stopped them from gaining mainstream traction and attention. What we're seeing now is that we have these new platforms. There are these new tools that actually make it so much easier for people to capture attention and imagination at scale in ways that we've never seen before. And so I think, I sort of go back to, can you deprogram people? Yes. The answer to that question is yes, you can. You can find ways to re-educate. You can bring people into new stories, absolutely. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we willing to let people continue to be captured? Are we willing to let media capture happen in the way that it is? Or are we willing to entertain new notions of what it means to think about technology, to think about its relationship to media, and actually come up with some new rules to guide the system that are actually fit for the times?
If anyone else wants to come in on that, you can just unmute.
This is Risha. I would double down on Andre's point. We can continue to get caught in a cycle where we're forced to think about how we deprogram people from being super racist or super sexist or anti-democracy. I think this connects to the earlier conversation about the tensions between free speech and hate speech. Whether Donald Trump should be banned from Twitter, which is a campaign that my organization Color of Change really worked on. We thought he shouldn't have been on Twitter 5 years ago, way before he started to run for president, or a campaign to put disclaimers on some of his content because he was spreading false information about vote by mail that had impacts on Black people. We forced social media companies to actually do a better job of policing content around and misinformation around COVID. There was a moment as the pandemic broke out where there were literally memes flying over social media saying that Black people were immune from COVID. We see the impacts of that sort of misinformation on the health and well-being of our community. We see the disparate effects of COVID. It was patently false. And these companies have a responsibility to actually make sure to protect their users, to protect the users that are using their platforms. And so as I think about my work as an organizer who is pushing for a more open society for Black people, I think I am super pro free speech. And part of my effort is is contending with the normalization of racism and sexism that holds me and the people that I love back from, living the so-called American dream.
I do think that one of the challenges for all of us is to understand to what extent has the extraordinary disruption of social media and the internet more generally created new problems or merely resurfaced old problems. When you think about other times of technological and especially media change, it's been moments like that where hate has been able to spread without the intermediation that previously had kept some of it in check. I think about radio. Yes, FDR used radio in the United States, but so did Father Coughlin. And of course, it was the new technology that Hitler and the totalitarians of the mid-20th century used. The challenge, I think, is that we are in a phase now where we all saw, I wouldn't say I'm a 1990s baby, but I certainly was part of that period where we saw the prospect of a world after the Cold War, where the social media as it existed, or the internet, we saw the extraordinary democratizing good that it could do. But I do think there's a really strong case to be made that it spreads hate and conspiracy thinking and tropes like QAnon, which to me is about one step away from being full-blown anti-Semitic, even though it hasn't always kind of gotten there yet, without the intermediation that we're used to. So will we have regulation? Will there be countervailing models? How do we bring these extraordinarily powerful but heavily unregulated major corporations into the rule of law in a way that we would want? I don't feel that we as a society have come close to gravitating toward the right answer or an answer on that. In the meantime, campaigns of the kind Color of Change does and others are some of the most important things that can be done. But sooner or later, we have to find an equilibrium if we're going to have an open society.
Right there, we have a number of questions kind of try to get to that very issue, which is, what regulations? And I know it's really tough. I mean, it's something that we are grappling with at PEN America, because there are enormous uncertainties about how different types of new laws and rules would actually play out, whether they would, in fact, zero in on the problems we're trying to solve versus create all kinds of other externalities that would impair the internet as a tool for communication and connection. So I'm curious, our audience is curious about whether folks on the panel have anything kind of specific you can say about, where you think regulation can most productively focus. Mark?
Yeah, well, I think, I think it's right that it's complicated. I think at the moment, the most attention has been paid to it in Europe. I think we'll see quite a lot of catch up from the US and other regions. But, around certain issues, such as, internet, the big internet companies needing to take on the responsibility of ownership of the product, and around the sort of fact-checking function and the kicking off of a Trump, long before it got to the point where it got to. I think, there are a set of responsibilities which can be legislated for, and I am completely certain there will be unintended externalities and consequences which, then need to be, we'll learn. The legislation will improve, the regulation will improve over time. And, obviously there's also issues around, personal data and privacy, et cetera, which also need to get woven into it. But I think just by saying it's hard is not a reason for not doing it. I mean, this is the biggest disruptive force in our lives. It's a threat to the values of the open society we all hold dear. We've just got to grip the problem and get on and work out what regulation works and try to drive it out globally and try to make it an area where people can agree, even though we know that, on the other side of the world, regulators are coming from the opposite end of the problem, which is, in a sense, a sort of censorship model. So we're going to have to find ways of meeting in the middle and not allowing a censorship model that prevents the sharing of news and information. So lots of challenges, but we need to get on with it.
Yeah, and I might just add to that. I think that there's a piece of this work that's about, first actually really getting a distinct sense of what the true harms are that are being caused by these businesses. So, Color of Change has done some wonderful work forcing Facebook to, think about doing this civil rights audit to actually ask the question, how are you building this product and what are the actual outcomes of the product that you're doing? Let's look across these entire businesses and understand. I think that we have massively underestimated as a society the harm that these companies are doing. It makes me think back to how we how we now think about cigarette companies, big tobacco. To me, Facebook is the Philip Morris of our generation. They are hiding intentionally the damage that their products are doing. They're doing that in order to make a greater profit, in the same way that the tobacco companies, added flavoring to try to sell cigarettes to children and put them on television and in movies to try to make it look sexy, even though they knew that it was killing people. In a lot of similar ways, we have a situation with the big tech companies where they are hiding, and we still have yet to fully grapple with where those harms are. And so I think, there is hard work to do to figure out the regulation, but I think first we have to figure out where the harms are, and that's going to be the source of driving the most aggressive regulation that I think we know needs to come.
Right, different question that was raised in the film that I have been wrestling with ever since it was articulated, which is that one of the functions of an open society is to seed a kind of healthy skepticism and readiness to question institutions and be a kind of vigorous distrust of authority that is the obligation of active citizenship. But at some point, does that sort of tip over into a kind of denialist or a populist dismissiveness of the role of democratic institutions, or just a sense that everything is too unreliable and too untrustworthy, whether it's the police, whether it's our public health system, whatever it may be. And does that undercut an open society? Does it open the door toward faith baseless faith in leaders who profess to have all the answers? And how can we get this equilibrium right? Michael, I'll start with you, but I'm curious what other folks think as well.
Well, it's a great question, because in some sense, and a lot of people have observed this, really since the 1960s, you've had this, maybe before, but certainly since the 60s, you've had this kind of relentless challenging and questioning of institutions by both the left and the right at various times, different institutions. But it's been one of the unifying things, at least again in the United States. And I think that the past 4 years in particular have reminded us of why there is a benefit also in a kind of a militant defense of institutions and of what might have seemed kind of hokey or corny verities. In the US context, checks and balances, for a long time, they looked like they were kind of an antiquated and musty obstruction to what needed to happen. But it turns out that our system too is prone to having a potential authoritarian take power, and that there's a reason why, whether it's expertise, science and other expertise in the executive branch, or checks and balances with Congress or independent courts, all of these things turn out to be really important. And so I think that one of the consequences of the Trump years is a reminder to a lot of us about why these institutions matter, not just to sound like sort of fuddy-duddies, saying in the good old days, everybody respected checks and balances, but to understand that they are vital protections even now. As Mark said before, history teaches that it's very often the first attempted authoritarian is something of a buffoon, but the next one comes along and is a lot smarter and better. And just like in the Roman Republic, the Gracchi were followed by Julius Caesar, who paid attention to what they got wrong. We may not be so lucky in some respects next time.
Mark?
Yeah,
and then Jesse?
I mean, I think that, we need to remain, I think probably the right phrase for it is critical friends of democratic institutions, challenging them, seeking their improvement, but understanding that in today's times particularly, we shouldn't be ripping them down and pulling them down. And I'm very struck that the modus operandi of Open Society Foundations for most of its life has really been one of shaming governments to do better on human rights. We go in, we build, we support local civil society, and allow it to confront breaches of the law, breaches of individuals' rights, etc. What we're finding is in growing parts of the world, the model doesn't work anymore because governments can't be shamed. They've embraced an authoritarian populist model, which means they're not embarrassed if they're held up against a rule of law they don't believe in anymore, or are trashing the rights of their citizens. So, this is a time where we have to kind of decide where the real fight is, and, really kind of confront those who've broken with the sort of democratic order, and where that democratic order still exists, work very hard to strengthen it and maintain it, to make sure the police are accountable, that you get criminal law reform in the US, but be careful not to try and bring whole institutions tumbling down at such a fragile moment for democracy in America.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that if you don't have strong institutions to protest against, then you run the risk of them collapsing. And, I think that we often lose sight where we're just always, the institutions don't have any support. And if we don't have that, then we could be in a worse off position than we are now, and I think that the last 4 years have taught us that, where Trump, purposely took away from all these institutions. And now we have the chance to reform them in a way that is strong, and we should take advantage of that.
I'm curious, Arisha or Andre, how, whether you would embrace that notion of kind of, the critical support, or the, sort of loyal dubiousness, perhaps, in regard to democratic institutions. Is that where you feel sort of your movements are, or would you frame it up differently?
You go for it, Arisha, and I'll follow you.
I sort of feel like I have to walk and chew bubblegum all the time. And I think we need institutions. Black people need institutions. We need workable governments. We need postal systems that work. We need roads. We need Black institutions that can continue to fight beyond when, Twitter gets bored of a conversation and sort of moves on to the next injustice. And so we very much need institutions. We also need institutions that are transparent, that are capable of saying, we got this wrong, we're gonna try to do this better, that are constantly working to improve. But I do fear, at the core of a lot of disinformation is, again, as has been repeated, is making us feel as if nothing can ever work. The mail system can't work. Vaccines don't work. Government doesn't work. Nothing works. And I don't know if we continue to go down that rabbit hole. I think we end up in a very, very dark place. I don't know.
Very much agree. And I think the only thing I would add to that is, to the extent that American institutions do work and work for most Americans, it's because Black people and other people of color have made significant investments and pushed those institutions to do that. And so I think there is a way in which, to the walking and chewing bubblegum at the same time, there is a way that you can see the work of protecting and defending institutions is also pushing them forward, is also making them dynamic and forcing them to really truly live out their mission, not just a mission that we sort of would have liked to thought that they were doing in some time in the past.
All right, I want to ask sort of one more question, then I'm going to give it to Mark to give the last word and talk a little bit about his relationship with George Soros. But my last question is about sort of the nexus or knife's edge between these xenophobic impulses that we see, and nativist impulses that we see in this country and around the world, and I think coming from an entirely different place, the rightful and kind of inspiring rise of a sort of identity politics where people are, focused more on the groups that they're part of the identities that they embody, and why those are important to them, not just personally, but politically. And, I'm curious if you could say anything about how you ultimately see that sort of fitting together. Is there a sort of trade-off? We've moved away from, ideals of a melting pot, and yet sort of the gorgeous mosaic, I don't think has ever really manifested in a sustainable way. And I'm curious sort of how you think about, ultimately embracing the positive sides of an identity politics while tamping down, this sort of noxious edge that it can take on within certain communities. I'll open it to whoever has a thought. I need a taker.
It's a tough question, obviously. I'm not sure what the answer is. You mean what's the tension between the idea of where we want to be and where we sometimes see these fumes of going on, that kind of idea?
Yeah, or can we sort of embrace the positive sides of a pluralistic kind of identity-centric society with that, while tamping down the really dangerous things that it can provoke or elicit in backlash?
Well, I think there's no other choice except to do that, because we can't give in to the darkness. We need to fight it, but we need to believe in the ideals of an open society, and there's just no other choice. We're not there, but we have to work our way towards that place. And you never arrive. The difference between a open society and sort of autocratic regimes is that they have an ideology that's fixed, that always fails. The open society, you never actually arrive there. You're always going to be working towards making it better, because there's always some marginalized group that's held out from the center in some way. So it's an ideal more than, and a destination that we're always going to be in the process of trying to achieve.
We have just a few more minutes. I want to turn to you, Mark, and ask about your decades-long relationship with George Soros. And I'm curious, having been a part of his work and observed it from your many perches over the years, sort of beyond what we've talked about already, how you think it's evolved. What tactics. You touched on shaming and how that is sort of running out of gas for various reasons. But what to you are the most important evolutions in the ways in which we defend an open society, and where do you think George Soros and the foundation will go next?
Well, thanks, and thanks to everybody on this. It's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, look. George, the first two places he worked were Central Europe and South Africa. So, already the issue of racial justice was very much in his mind, even before, everything that has happened in America since. I mean, just for him, this was a huge sort of crime that had to be corrected. And particularly in the years after apartheid fell, his foundation there was a center of his passions and ambitions. But whether it was there or whether it was in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, what marked out George's philanthropy always was its sort of originality and his lateral thinking. I remember in the around 1990, sitting in his garden with him, and he suddenly announces, we're going to save Russian science, that it would be a disaster if all Russian scientists went to the West, and that extraordinary scientific capital was depleted. So he constructed an extraordinary scheme of paying stipends to the Russian science community. And you know, what I find is, in that sense, a hired manager, his friend for 30 years, but nevertheless, you know, somebody who's been on his board, but is a hired manager to run the foundation, is the challenge of preserving George's originality, of not just sinking into a second or third generation foundation where you just go through the rote motions of doing things the way it's done in foundation world, to, you know, have the sort of originality of an individual who grew up through this extraordinary experience of Eastern Europe at that time, but combined it with this world-breaking ability to make money in the financial markets, and, you know, the big bet, the originality, the thinking around the next corner that others couldn't do. And my life with George, which has been over those, as you say, over 30 years or more, you know, I've seen that in spades. You know, I first met him when I wanted some help. I was advising the opposition in Chile to Pinochet. He immediately helped me with support to do polling and focus groups in the country. But through later, when I was running the UN development program, and we agreed we were going to try and reform the civil service of Georgia by putting a fund up to pay civil servants and double their salaries and half their numbers to create a major civil service reform. And, you know, it was that sort of big out of the box ideas, but always centered on how can we make societies better, more open, more liberal, more progressive, which is, you know, his legacy, not just to OSF, but I think more widely. And, you know, I think Jesse's done a great job of capturing George the man and rescuing him from these extraordinary tropes and myths that the haters are out to build.
Thank you. That's sort of inspiring note to end on, the idea of sustaining that kind of originality and big thinking and new thinking as we confront these challenges, each of us in our own work. So I want to thank this really terrific panel. I certainly enjoyed the conversation very much and learned something from all of you, and our engaged audience. Thanks for being with us, and thanks to the Brennan Center for partnering with us. If you haven't seen the film, I think there are details about where and how you can see it, and it's absolutely worthwhile and deeply thought-provoking and inspiring. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Take care. Bye-bye.